Hi folks, and welcome to part 2 of this lesson in regards to public schools and their influence on sports. So where we got up to in regards to lesson and part 1 was looking at this keyword in regards to rationalisation and codification. And when we talk about those specific words, we're talking about the formulation of formal writing and recorded rules of a sport, okay? And the public schoolboys, especially those students, those highly intellectual students, had a big influence in regards to starting to codify, starting to create rules for these specific sports such as rugby and such as football, okay? So as we move on in regards to this lesson, if we start to look at the impacts of athleticism, and we talked about athleticism being this core value of integrity, of sportsmanship, of honesty, and when we think of those key principles through sport, within public schools, there was a big emphasis on encouraging effort over winning. And ultimately, the head teacher, the teachers within these public schools looked at the character development of these students in ensuring that they put the high amount of effort in rather than the focus being on winning. If we look at today, those kind of those values have maybe shifted a little bit. If we think of professional sport, the main emphasis is now on winning. Yes, of course, we need to put in effort normally to win, but ultimately there's, I think, a bigger demand in regards to media coverage, media pressure, and pressure from other external sources and internal sources, for that matter, to win. There was also an encouragement to develop codified sports. So it was encouraged that students would write down key rules, would actually develop and sit down in groups and actually come up with and formulate some of these specific codified rules. And ultimately, we can see that in terms of the creation of national governing bodies. So in 1863, a good example in terms of the Football Association, the FA that was set up, that would have been set up by public schoolboy students that went on perhaps to university. So Oxbridge students, for example, okay, creating these standardised rules that would then be used nationally across the country. And ultimately, we can also look at athleticism in terms of the impacts in regards to encouraging fair play, encouraging sportsmanship. Okay, so again, when the teachers, the head teacher would have been watching a lot of these matches, they would be encouraging, okay, the handshake, the respect, losing and winning with integrity. So if we look at the impact of cult, let's look back at what that word cult meant. So when we think of the word cult, we're talking about this obsession, this development of the key ideals, okay, within sport. So through this cult of athleticism, this obsession with wanting and devoting our time to play sport, there was a high amount and a large amount of time devoted to sport in schools. And ultimately, if we had more time to play sport, then obviously that helped develop sport overall during this period of time. And we could do that through inter-school and intra-school sport. So inter-school sport talks about, playing against other colleges, other schools, and there had been dedicated time to do this. We think of, for example, in sixth form today, we have on a Wednesday afternoon, for example, dedicated time to play some dedicated competitive sport against other schools and other colleges perhaps. Okay, so this would have been, this would have happened because of the past in regards to public schools playing one another. But we also had a big emphasis on intra-school, so playing internally through things like the house systems that were created within each school. And this obviously helped create things like develop leagues, for example, okay, where we would play in different houses against each other. It would create obviously leagues locally, but also regionally and even nationally when it comes to looking at today. We think of today and we've got, borough level matches, don't we, in terms of our borough. County matches, okay, if we look at maybe regional and district matches, whether it be through, for example, like Middlesex, or whether it be through the Essex County, for example. And then we've got national leagues which still exist today, don't we, in terms of the ESFA, so the English Schools Football Association, where we can play in a competition that is nationwide over 1,000 or 2,000 schools, for example. And then we've got this idea of ex-students, okay, so once they've finished within their public school, spreading this cult. So spreading their ideals, their key principles, okay, through what we call old boy networks, okay, and we're going to look now at how they exported some of these key principles and sports within the globe. So let's look at how public schools did that. So the first way that they could have done that is through this idea of universities. Okay, so a lot of students from public schools went on to university. So it could be in Oxbridge, okay, which would have been a combination of Oxford and Cambridge students coming together. And these places created what we call a melting pot of sports. So different experiences, different rules coming together within each and their own experiences of sport. And once they put them in the so-called melting pot, okay, we think of a pot where we throw lots of ingredients in, okay, ultimately they would have come up with a standardized set of rules and ideals for a specific sport. Okay, so Eton, in the previous slide I had a picture of Eton College, and you saw a wall, okay, and they would have incorporated a wall while they played football, so you could kick the ball off the wall and that could be incorporated in it. Harrow wouldn't have included a wall, they wouldn't have had a wall in it. So all of these rules would have been put together, and ultimately they would have created a standardised set of rules so that it was fair for everyone. We also had a lot of ex-public school boys who went on to be army officers and soldiers, and that meant that they spread the sports internationally through different means. Interestingly enough, if you kind of Google it, if you sort of have a research around, a good example is looking at some sports badges of teams abroad. AC Milan, for example, in Milan in Italy, if you look at their badge, they've got the St. George's flag within their badge, and ultimately that club would have been formed by some ex-public school boys. You might want to have a look around and see if you can find any other European or global clubs that would have been created by public school boys as well. Obviously, a lot of ex-public school boys became parents, and obviously they influenced their children, and they would have done that by sending them also to the same schools, so that carried on those generations in regards to that cult. Some ex-students would have gone on to be teachers. So again, they promoted the importance of sport. They promoted the aspects of teaching others through sport, so through mentors, prefects, and so on. And also, some ex-students would have gone on to have a prominent role within the church, okay, through a priest or through clergy, and that meant obviously joining the churches, but also forming those parish teams, okay, and even joining missionaries where they travelled internationally, where again it helped to set up and formulate teams, okay, on a global basis. We also had some students who went on to work in factories, and they may have been the owners of those factories. And key example, if you've had time to look at the English Game on Netflix, for example, shows those factory owners and the influence of them in regarding sorting and organising work-related sports teams. And the last one is looking at community leaders. A lot of ex-students went on to be community leaders, so things like politicians, and establishing key roles within the government, which eventually formulated standardised education and physical education as we know it today, which we'll look at in the 21st century lesson a little later. Okay, so before we finish today's lesson, I want you to see if you can answer this question here. So pause your video here, 5 marks, let's see if you can answer it. Okay, so hopefully you come up with an answer. This is the mark scheme that you could have used to help you create and establish 5 marks. So look through that mark scheme there in terms of explaining how public schools influence sport in that post-1850 era. So you could have talked about the fact that it promoted sport and games as being really important. We had public figures, okay, that were well respected in terms of Dr. Thomas Arnold or other head teachers. You could have mentioned other things there in regards to that development of the cult of athleticism, fair play, moral integrity, the establishment of rules. Okay, so all of those things would have been included. I haven't talked about the third bottom one in terms of Christianity or muscular Christianity, but when we talk about muscular Christianity, that refers to and it looks at this idea of religion and sport coming together. And if we think of a prominent Christian, the core values, okay, then that replicated, that kind of clearly kind of linked in with the core values within sport. Okay, so being honest with yourself and with others, showing others respect. So all of those things, those key values, came together through what we call muscular Christianity. And finally, for the practitioners, when we think of the teaching and learning strategies, I think obviously watching the Tom Brown School Days is a really useful kind of film to watch in regards to just what public schools were like in regards to sport, but also in regards to the bullying that occurred and the fear that was created among teachers and the changes that Dr. Thomas Arnold would have created during this time. I think it's important to maybe do some research in regards to Dr. Thomas Arnold, not too much, you don't want to overload it, but just to see what his core values were and how he changed the philosophy during this time. And then finally have some discussions in terms of discuss the ideals and the values of sport today in regards to how have they helped and how have they kind of influenced individuals in society, but also think of the next steps when we're looking at 21st century sport as we know it today. How have those ideals perhaps changed, and is there a move away from public school and Olympic values? Okay, and if that's the case, then why? Get students to kind of really think about that and talk about that as well. Okay, so best of luck. Hope those 2 parts to this video have really helped with this topic and to solidify that. Okay, thanks.